It all started as just a weekend getaway, but I don't know. Looking back, it felt like the beginning of something I couldn't have anticipated. Jake and I had been talking about taking a road trip for weeks. Both of us were burnt out from work, tired of the same routine. It felt like we were stuck in a loop of emails, deadlines, and stress. So when we finally had a weekend off together, we made the spontaneous decision to drive out to this remote spot in the woods, far from everything. Just us, the car, and the open road. We loaded up the car with snacks, drinks, and our camping gear. I remember laughing, telling Jake we'd need more than a few bags of chips to survive out there. He rolled his eyes, joking that I packed like I was going on a month-long expedition. It was the kind of light-hearted banter that had been missing from our days lately. As we drove deeper into the woods, the landscape began to change. The roads grew narrower, the trees taller, until the dense forest seemed to swallow us whole. The sky was clear at first, but the sun started to set, turning everything around us a soft golden hue. There was something peaceful about it, honestly. The road ahead was empty, save for the occasional curve or pothole that Jake skillfully avoided. I could hear the tires humming softly against the pavement and the radio playing one of our favorite songs. We were almost there, just a few more miles, when the world around us suddenly grew quiet. I noticed it first, the sudden drop in sound. The birds that had been chirping nonstop seemed to vanish, the wind stilled completely. Even the tires on the car seemed to be quieter now. It was like we'd entered a vacuum. Did you hear that? I asked, a little confused. I wasn't sure if it was the radio messing up or something else. Jake glanced at me, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. You're paranoid, babe. It's just the woods. We're almost there. Don't worry about it. I chuckled, agreeing with him, but still something felt off. But I didn't want to be that girl, the one who freaks out over nothing. Then as we rounded a sharp bend in the road, we saw it. A massive fallen tree sprawled across the road like an obstacle from a nightmare. It was big, like really big. The trunk was thick and the branches stretched out in every direction, blocking the entire path. We could have driven around it if we tried, but it was wedged so tightly that there was no way to get through. Jake slammed on the brakes, the car jerking to a stop. I felt my stomach twist. For a second, neither of us spoke. Jake turned off the engine and glanced at the tree. Well, looks like we're gonna have to move it. Shouldn't be too hard, right? I nodded, but I wasn't so sure. I had this sinking feeling in my gut, something telling me this was no ordinary tree fall. But Jake was already out of the car before I could voice my concerns. He always liked to be the problem solver. I watched him walk toward the tree, hands in his pockets, his confident stride never wavering. I tried to shake off the tension creeping up my spine, but it was hard. The silence of the forest was oppressive, now heavy. There was no chirping, no rustling in the leaves, not even a breeze. Just this eerie stillness that made the air feel thick and uncomfortable. Sitting there alone in the car, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid. But my eyes kept drifting back to the trees, their shadows stretching unnaturally long as the sun dipped lower behind them. The way the forest seemed to close in around us. How everything felt too quiet. I turned to look out the other side of the car, trying to distract myself, when I saw something that made my heart stop. It was barely visible at first, just a flicker of movement through the trees. I thought I imagined it, but no. There was something or someone moving between the trunks. And it wasn't the wind. It was too deliberate, too wrong. I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I turned quickly, wanting to call out to Jake, but he was already working on the tree, his back to me. The feeling of being watched only intensified. And then, just as I was about to shout his name, a low, bone-chilling crack echoed through the woods. My heart skipped. Not the sound of branches breaking or a tree swaying in the wind. No, this was different. It was like something was moving through the trees, something heavy, something wrong. I watched in horror as, from the thick brush, figures began to crawl out, slow at first, like they were testing the air. And then they moved faster, quicker, pushing through the undergrowth, emerging into the open. I couldn't make sense of what I was seeing at first, figures human-like, but not human. They were dressed in shredded clothes, faces hidden behind grotesque animal masks, some kind of hideous hybrid creatures. There was one in a deer mask, the antlers protruding at odd angles, its body unnaturally tall and thin, the limbs twitching as if not quite used to movement. Another had a wolf mask, but it was too big for its head, and its eyes were hollow, sunken deep into its skull. Their bodies were warped, twisted, like they were part of the forest itself. Before I could process it, I heard Jake shout from the other side of the car. Everything about this situation screamed danger, but my brain couldn't fully grasp the reality of it at first. The forest, which moments ago had seemed so serene, now felt like a trap. It was suffocating. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and as the creatures, things began crawling from the shadows, I could feel the hairs on my arms standing on end. The first one I saw was tall, too tall, and it had this deer mask with jagged antlers that seemed to grow out of its skull like they were part of it, not something it wore. Its body was unnaturally thin, its skin stretched too tightly over its bones, and its movements were jerky. The creature's head tilted in my direction, those hollow eye sockets peering at me like it could see straight into my soul. My heart started pounding, the blood in my veins turning to ice. The second creature came next. It was crouched low to the ground, its face obscured by a wolf mask that looked like it had been sewn together from scraps of tattered leather and animal hide. Its eyes were too wide, too empty, like they'd been carved into the mask, and the lips stretched back over its teeth in a permanent snarl. The thing was covered in filthy rags that hung off its body like it had just rolled out of the dirt. It was moving with this strange, twisted grace, like a predator stalking its prey. Its sharp, gnarled claws scraped against the ground as it advanced, sniffing the air, its nose twitching. Then came more and more of them, crawling, dragging their bodies out from beneath the trees, their movement so unnaturally fast that my mind could barely keep up. I counted at least 4 or 5, each more terrifying than the last, their animal masks so grotesque that they looked like they were part of the creature itself. I could hear the sound of their breathing, low and labored, like they had been waiting for something for us. Jake turned just as the deer mask thing lunged for him. His hand shot out to push it away, but it was too strong. It was like the thing had no real weight to it, but the force behind its grip was enough to make Jake stagger. He screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed in the stillness of the woods. I felt my stomach churn as I saw the claws of the creature dig into his arm, its fingers digging so deep into his skin that blood began to drip onto the ground. It didn't even flinch as it yanked him closer, pulling him toward it with a strength I couldn't fathom. Jake shoved at it again, trying to fight it off, but it was useless. The wolf-masked one was faster than Jake expected, and before he could react, it grabbed him from behind, pulling him into a headlock with its long, twisted arms. Jake's eyes locked onto mine, wide with panic. His voice was strangled, his breath shallow, but I heard him clearly. "Run," he shouted. "Get in the car, now." I don't know what happened next. I just felt a cold, terrifying instinct take over. I didn't think. I just ran. I slammed my foot down on the accelerator, the car door flinging open as I scrambled out. The sound of the creature's distorted growls and the horrible screech of their claws scraping against the pavement rang in my ears as I tore through the woods, branches smacking me in the face, roots tangling around my feet. And the only thing I could hear was my own frantic breath. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel them getting closer. I could hear their shrill, animal-like screeches. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. I could barely see through the thickening darkness, the last remnants of daylight vanishing as the trees closed in around me. I ran like my life depended on it, because in that moment it absolutely did. The ground beneath me was uneven, and I nearly tripped several times, but I forced myself forward, putting one foot in front of the other. My pulse was pounding in my ears, my thoughts scattered, and all I could focus on was moving, getting away. That's when I heard it. A scream. Not from Jake. No, this scream was louder, more guttural, as if it was part of the forest itself. I stumbled to a stop, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I wouldn't. But I could hear the creatures closing in. They were relentless, a pack moving with terrifying speed. The wolf mask was the closest, its heavy footsteps thundering behind me, dragging something heavy across the forest floor. I could hear it breathing, its rasping breaths drawing closer. I was in the middle of a nightmare. I had no plan, no idea where I was going, but something told me I couldn't stay on the path. I darted into the woods, deeper into the trees. I didn't know where the hell I was heading, but I just needed to get away. I found a hollow in a massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that I could squeeze myself into the space between the roots. My chest was heaving as I crouched in the darkness, hiding from whatever was hunting me. My fingers dug into the dirt, my nails scraping against the rough bark as I tried to steady my breath. I stayed as still as possible, praying that the things wouldn't find me. From my hiding spot, I could hear them searching. The creatures, no, the maniacs, were all around me, their footsteps heavy on the ground as they moved in groups, their animal masks glinting in the faint light of the torches they carried. Their growls were growing louder, and every so often, I'd hear one of them bark out orders to the others. They were communicating, coordinating their search. I thought I might die there, alone, buried in the dirt and under the weight of their terrifying presence. But I didn't. I stayed hidden, my heart in my throat, barely able to breathe as I waited, listening to the horrible sounds of their hunt. The night was thick with terror, and it felt like the forest was alive, watching, waiting. I stayed still, every muscle in my body screaming to move. But I knew that if I made a sound, if I shifted an inch, they would find me. The creatures, the maniacs in their grotesque animal masks, were still searching for me. I could hear their voices, low, guttural, and unintelligible, calling out to each other as they scoured the trees. The sound of their footsteps was uneven, scraping against the ground like they were part of the very earth itself, as though they belonged here in a way I couldn't understand. Every once in a while, one of them would stop, sniffing the air, its nose twitching like they were trying to pick up on my scent. I held my breath, pressing myself deeper into the hollow, trying to shrink into the darkness. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of dirt and something foul, something decayed. It was suffocating, the smell lingering in the back of my throat, but I couldn't risk making a sound. I wasn't sure how much time passed. Minutes? Hours? I had no way of knowing. But eventually the search grew quieter. I thought for a moment that they might have given up, that they might have moved on. But then just when I dared to exhale, I heard it. A scream. Not from Jake. No, this scream was different. It was distorted, guttural, and it echoed through the trees like it was coming from deep inside the woods. I recognized it immediately. It was the sound of someone in agony, someone being ripped apart. My stomach twisted in horror. Jake. I knew it was Jake. The scream was unmistakable. The raw, desperate sound of someone trying to fight back. But it was hopeless. My heart stopped for a beat, and all I could think was that I had to keep moving. I had to get away, but I felt this horrible, sickening pull in my chest. A need to run to him to help, but I knew it was too late. It was too late for both of us. I fought the urge to break down and cry. I couldn't. If I did, I would die. I had to stay focused. I waited for a long while, the sounds of the creatures fading, but the fear gnawing at me like an animal biting into my soul. When I finally dared to move, my legs were weak, unsteady, but I forced myself to stand. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest like it might explode. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to get out. I ran, moving as quietly as I could, ducking low to the ground, listening for any sound of pursuit. My body was on autopilot now, survival mode kicked in. Every crack of a branch underfoot sent a shock of panic through me, but I kept going. The trees closed in tighter around me as I moved, their shadows stretching long and twisted under the pale moonlight. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of pine and rot. Every time I thought I heard a noise behind me, my heart leapt into my throat, and I found myself running faster. I wasn't sure how much time passed. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours. All I knew was that I had to keep running, or I would never make it out of the forest alive. And then I heard it. A sound. It wasn't the growls of the creatures. No, this sound was more human. Footsteps. Heavy, uneven footsteps crunching through the brush, and I froze. I didn't dare breathe, not even for a second. The sound got closer and I held my breath, praying they wouldn't find me. And then I saw him. The maniac in the pig mask was stalking through the trees, moving slowly, deliberately. His costume was disgusting, ragged clothes and a grotesque, blood-splattered pig mask that looked like something out of a nightmare. The eyes of the mask were hollow but somehow still seemed to pierce through the dark. His hands were gloved in something slick, black, like oil or blood, and he was holding a large, rusted knife in one hand. The blade glinted in the moonlight, and I could feel my blood run cold as I watched him. He was searching for me, moving with the predator's focus, I scanning the ground, nose sniffing the air. I didn't even think. I just ran. My legs burned as I pushed myself harder, my breath ragged and panicked. The sound of the maniac in the pig mask was getting closer, his steps louder, faster, and I knew he was following me. I didn't have much of a head start, and I could hear him gaining on me, his steps pounding against the earth like a drumbeat. Desperation surged through me. I didn't know where to go, didn't know where to hide. But then I spotted it. A small dark hole in the ground, beneath a massive tree. It was barely wide enough for me to squeeze into, but it was the only chance I had. I didn't hesitate. I threw myself into it, scrambling to bury myself in the dirt, pressing my back against the cold earth, my heart pounding in my chest. I stayed as still as I could, breathing through my nose, trying not to make a sound. My eyes were wide in terror, staring out into the darkness, waiting for the maniac to pass. The world around me was silent. The footsteps stopped. I could hear nothing but my own ragged breathing, the blood thudding in my ears. And then I felt it. A sharp, crawling sensation on my skin. Something was moving across my body. I gasped in terror, but I couldn't make a sound. I could feel it, tiny legs, skittering over my skin, moving in slow, deliberate motions. I closed my eyes, holding my breath, trying not to scream. The creatures, whatever they were crawling over me, their cold, slimy bodies brushing against mine. The smell of rot and decay filled my nostrils, and I could feel the wetness of their bodies pressing against me, their movement so unnatural, so wrong. I stayed perfectly still, praying they wouldn't notice me. I couldn't move. I couldn't make a sound. And then, just as I thought my heart would burst from the pressure, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time. The footsteps drew closer, slow but deliberate. My heart hammered in my chest, the rhythm of it echoing in my ears as I desperately tried to keep still, to make myself as small and invisible as possible. I could feel the creatures crawling around me, the vile, unnatural movements of their bodies brushing against my skin. I wanted to scream, to bolt from the hole and run as fast as I could, but I knew it would be the end of me. I could hear the maniac's heavy breathing now, right above me, close enough that I could smell the rancid, metallic scent of sweat and blood. He was circling the tree, his boots crunching the leaves and branches with each step, the sound so loud in the silence that it felt like he was right on top of me. I pressed myself deeper into the hole, my fingers digging into the dirt, my nails scraping against the rough surface, my chest rising and falling with shallow, panicked breaths. I didn't dare move. Not a single inch. The pig-masked maniac paused for a moment, just inches away from where I hid. His breathing was ragged, almost like he was sniffing the air, trying to track me. I could hear him grunt, his voice muffled and inhuman as he muttered something under his breath. It sounded like a low growl, something so guttural it sent chills down my spine. His hand gripped the rusted knife, the metal glinting faintly in the moonlight. My eyes locked onto his, though he couldn't see me. I prayed he didn't hear my heartbeat thumping against my ribs, so loud it felt like it could tear through the air. Every second felt like an eternity, a crushing weight pressing down on me as the pig-masked maniac circled the tree, searching, hunting. Time stretched and snapped like a taut wire, and then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the maniac turned and started to move away. I held my breath, feeling a surge of relief. He was leaving. He was gone. But I knew it wasn't over. I waited, listening to the fading sound of his footsteps. My body ached from being so still for so long, my limbs stiff and trembling with exhaustion. The cold earth beneath me felt like it was pressing against my ribs, making it harder to breathe, but I had no choice. I couldn't move yet. I couldn't risk it. Minutes passed, or maybe it was hours. The sounds of the creatures, the maniac and the pig mask, seemed to grow distant, and I thought I might have a chance to escape. But deep down, I knew I wasn't safe. I wasn't safe anywhere. I slowly began to pull myself out of the hole, every movement careful and measured, trying to make as little noise as possible. My fingers scraped against the damp earth as I emerged from the dark cavity, my legs weak and unsteady. I crouched low, staying in the shadows, my eyes darting between the trees, my senses heightened, every noise amplified in the night. The forest felt alive, alive with malice. And then it hit me. The sound of footsteps. This time, they weren't distant. They were close. Too close. I spun around, my heart lurching into my throat, and there they were. The creatures, them, emerged from the shadows, crawling from behind the trees, their masks glinting in the dim light. The maniac with the deer mask was leading the group, his long limbs dragging him across the ground in that same jerky, unnatural motion. Behind him, the wolf-masked creature followed, its sharp claws scraping against the dirt. The others moved in sync, their heads tilting as if they were trying to catch my scent, their eyes fixed on me with unnerving precision. I couldn't breathe. My chest tightened, my thoughts scrambling to form a plan, but there was no plan. There was nothing. I turned to run, my legs screaming in protest, but I wasn't fast enough. The creatures, no, the maniacs, were quicker. They were too fast. One of them, the one with the wolf mask, leapt forward, its jagged claws outstretched, and I felt a sharp, burning pain across my arm as it grabbed hold of me. I screamed, but the sound was cut off by the creature's grip, its claws digging into my flesh, pulling me backward. I kicked and fought, but it was useless. The creature dragged me away from the shadows, its strength overwhelming, its grip unrelenting. The others closed in around me, their animal masks gleaming in the dark, their distorted faces twisted in mockery. I was surrounded. But in that moment, a thought flickered in my mind: the car. I had to get back to the car. I had to survive. With every ounce of strength I had left, I wrenched my arm free from the creature's grip, my skin tearing as I fought against its hold. I stumbled, barely staying on my feet, but I didn't look back. I ran blindly, desperately, toward the spot where I had left the car. My feet hit the ground hard, my breath coming in jagged, ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs. The sounds of the creature's pursuit were deafening, their growls and screeches echoing through the trees. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't slow down. I had to make it. The car came into view just up ahead. I could see the headlights in the distance, barely visible through the trees, and I pushed myself harder, my legs screaming in agony as I ran faster. I could hear them getting closer, the pounding of their feet on the ground behind me, but I wouldn't stop. I wouldn't let them catch me. With one last desperate burst of speed, I reached the car. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut behind me with a force that made the vehicle shudder. My hands were shaking as I fumbled for the keys, but I managed to turn the ignition. And then I drove. The tires screeched as I sped down the narrow path, the car bouncing over the uneven ground, the headlights cutting through the darkness. My heart was still racing, the terror that gripped me refusing to let go, but I couldn't stop. I had to get away. But I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still following me, that the maniacal, grotesque creatures in their animal masks were still out there, hunting me. I felt their eyes on me, even though I didn't dare look back. As I sped away, I couldn't help but wonder how much of this nightmare was real, and how much of it was in my head. The fear, the adrenaline, the images of those twisted creatures, they were burned into my mind, and I could feel the weight of it all pressing down on me. I wasn't safe. The night felt like it stretched on forever, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. The car tore through the darkness, the headlights barely cutting through the dense trees that loomed on either side of the road. The feeling of eyes on me, of being watched, never left. It clung to me like a second skin. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I half expected to see one of those creatures crawling up behind me, its grotesque mask leering in the reflection. But there was nothing. Just the empty road. The trees. The endless night. I tried to shake it off. I told myself I was just imagining things. The adrenaline, the terror, it was messing with my mind. But the feeling of dread gnawed at me from the inside out. It wouldn't go away. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning in ways I didn't recognize. My hands were slick with sweat as I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white from the strain. The cold air from the cracked window did little to calm the heat that burned under my skin. I kept my eyes fixed on the road ahead, but every sound, the wind rustling the trees, the hum of the car's engine, felt like it was part of the hunt. Like they were still out there, waiting for me to slip up. I drove and drove, until I had no idea how far I'd gone. My mind was racing, too many thoughts and too many images running through my head. Jake. I couldn't stop thinking about him, his screams, the way those creatures had torn into him. The way they enjoyed it, like it was some sick game. I wanted to scream. I wanted to scream until my voice was gone, but I couldn't. I couldn't break down. Not yet. It wasn't until the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon that I allowed myself to slow down. I pulled off to the side of the road, my hands shaking so badly I could barely manage to turn the wheel. I had no idea where I was, but I couldn't keep driving. Not anymore. I stepped out of the car, my legs unsteady as I took in the early morning air. The sky was gray, the sun just barely rising, casting an eerie, pale light over everything. The world felt wrong. Everything was too still. Too quiet. I stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to steady myself. My head was spinning, my vision blurred as I tried to make sense of what had happened. It was like a nightmare, a horrible, impossible nightmare, but it was real. I knew it was real. And then it hit me. The place where Jake had died. The forest. The blood. I turned to face the road, my stomach turning as I realized where I was. It was too close. Too damn close to where we had been. The thought made my stomach lurch, a fresh wave of panic sweeping over me. I had to go back. I couldn't just leave him there. I couldn't leave his body for those things to... No, I couldn't think about it. I started the car again, my hands still shaking as I turned the key. I told myself I had to get far away. I had to leave, but I couldn't bring myself to leave without knowing. Without seeing if there was anything left of him. I couldn't let them have him. I didn't know what I was hoping for. But I drove back, even though every part of me screamed not to. The whole time I felt it, the feeling that they were following me, that they were out there. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see one of those things behind me. The pig-masked maniac. The wolf. The others. Their eyes in the darkness, their twisted smiles. But nothing. I reached the edge of the forest, the spot where we had parked earlier that night. My heart was in my throat, my chest tight as I steered the car off the road. I barely got out before I froze. The area where Jake had died, where I left him, was empty. But it wasn't empty. There was blood everywhere. I felt my breath catch in my throat, my knees going weak as I stepped out of the car. The blood was smeared across the dirt in long, thick streaks that led off into the trees. It was like the earth itself was stained, a mark of something unthinkable, something unspeakable. My hands were shaking as I reached for the door, but I couldn't take my eyes off the blood. Where was he? Where was Jake? I walked cautiously toward the spot where we had left the car, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no sign of him, no trace of his body, no sign that he had ever been there at all. The forest was still, silent. The air was heavy with something that made it hard to breathe, as though the very place was suffocating me. And then I saw it. A single twisted tree stump. I didn't understand at first. But as I got closer, I saw the pattern of the blood, how it smeared against the bark of the tree, like something or someone had been dragged across it. No! My stomach churned as I stepped back, the blood rushing to my ears. The scream came from deep within my chest, but I didn't let it escape. I couldn't. I turned away. I couldn't stay there. Not after what I'd seen. I ran back to the car, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I fumbled for the door. I climbed inside, slamming it shut behind me, my hands numb as I gripped the wheel. I had to get out of there. I had to go. I didn't care where. I just had to keep moving. Keep going. As I drove away, the feeling didn't leave me. That sense of being followed. Of being watched. I looked in the rearview mirror again, my eyes scanning the empty road behind me. But this time, I saw something. A flicker of movement in the trees. I couldn't shake the feeling. The one that gnawed at me from the inside, like fingers running down my spine, tugging at my sanity with every passing second. The eyes. They were still on me. I could feel them, even though I didn't dare look back. I just kept my foot pressed hard on the gas, the engine roaring as I pushed the car faster, tearing down the winding road. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't care. I just had to keep moving. The thought of stopping, of taking a breath, felt like it might be my last. The trees passed in a blur, the roads dark and endless, a tunnel that I couldn't escape. Every little sound was amplified, every rustle of leaves in the wind, every crack of a twig underfoot, and I was sure they were out there. Those creatures. The maniacs. Waiting, following, hunting. They never left. They were always one step behind, just out of sight. I couldn't help but glance in the rearview mirror again, a sick, twisted hope that maybe I had outrun them. But the reflection showed nothing but empty road. For a split second, I let myself breathe. But then there in the distance, just visible between the trees, I saw something. The flicker of a figure. No. More than one. My stomach twisted, my pulse hammering. I gripped the wheel harder, my knuckles white. They were behind me. They were following. There was no doubt anymore. The pig mask. The wolf. The twisted deer mask. All of them. I drove faster. My foot pressed harder against the gas pedal until the car felt like it might tear apart. But I couldn't escape the fear. It wrapped itself around me like a noose, choking me with every breath. The highway stretched on, but it felt like it was never ending. My mind was splintering, the exhaustion catching up with me, the lack of sleep and the weight of what I had seen threatening to tear me apart. The blood. Jake. I couldn't escape the images, the sounds of his screams, the awful, sickening glee in their movements. I could still hear the crack of bone, the horrible laughter. The darkness around me seemed to close in, and then I saw it. A figure on the side of the road. A man in a mask. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car fishtailed and skidded to a stop. My breath came in ragged gasps, panic flooding my veins. I didn't know if it was real. I didn't care. I just had to get away. I threw the car into reverse, desperate to put distance between us, between me and whatever that thing was. But the road was narrowing, the trees growing thicker, the feeling of being trapped closing in on me. I looked in the rearview mirror again, and there they were. All of them. The figures, no longer just shadows, were emerging from the trees. The same grotesque creatures, their masks gleaming in the moonlight. The pig mask. The wolf. The deer. The others. There were more than I remembered. Their eyes gleamed with that sick, twisted hunger. They were closing in, all of them, their hands reaching for the car for me. My breath was shallow, my vision blurred, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't. I slammed the car into drive again and sped forward, my heart beating so hard I thought it might burst. But it was too late. A hand slammed against the window, the sound of it so loud it nearly shattered my eardrums. I screamed, my body trembling uncontrollably as I jerked the wheel, swerving across the road, desperately trying to dodge them. The creatures were everywhere now, crawling across the road, moving faster than I could react. I tried to keep the car on the road, tried to steer through the madness, but the car lurched as something struck the side, sending it spinning out of control. The world spun as the car flipped, tumbling end over end, everything a blur of metal and glass and screams. And then the silence. I don't know how long I was out. Maybe minutes. Maybe hours. The world around me was broken, shattered, the car a twisted wreck. My body was bruised and battered, my head aching like it might split open, but I was still alive. Somehow. But the silence was the worst part. The silence, the stillness in the air, like the world was holding its breath. I didn't dare move at first. I could still feel their eyes, still hear the rustling of the trees, the faintest sound of movement that sent a new wave of terror through me. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't stay in that wreck. I had to get out. With every ounce of strength I had left, I pulled myself from the wreckage. My hands shook as I struggled to open the door, but it was stuck. The car was crushed, mangled beyond recognition, but the door finally gave way with a screech of metal. I stumbled out of the car, my legs giving way beneath me as I hit the ground. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what I was doing. But I was running. I ran blindly, the forest stretching out in every direction, the trees like dark sentinels surrounding me. The ground was uneven, my feet tripping over roots, branches grabbing at my clothes, but I didn't care. I had to move. I could hear them again, the creatures, the sound of their twisted footsteps moving closer. My heart was hammering in my chest, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps as I stumbled through the forest, crashing through the underbrush. The light of dawn was barely a faint glow on the horizon, but it felt like the end of everything. I felt my mind slipping, my thoughts fraying like thread pulled too tight. I don't know how much time passed, minutes, hours, days, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. Eventually, I reached the edge of the forest, my body aching, my legs ready to give out, but there was something else. Something I couldn't shake. The feeling that they were still out there. That I wasn't safe. That they were always behind me. I don't know if I made it. I don't know if I ever left. But I hear them still. I feel their eyes on me. And I'm running.